There we are, green light. I think this might be a tray for water, but I am sure I would spill it or mess it up, so I won't use it. I am Chuck McCoy. Most of you don't know me, and in that you're probably blessed. Brian asked me if I would fill in. I was in ministry for 43 years. 31 of those was teaching theology, Bible, church history, apologetics in Christian colleges. So I prepare like I'm preparing for a class. I'm going to give you more than some of you will want today, but I want you to look at this as a smorgasbord. When you walk in and say, I can't eat all that food. Well, you're not supposed to. You just go and take the things that'll fit on your plate. So I'm going to share with you some things. Hopefully you can look at them later. If you didn't get the notes, but you want to look at some of these, I'm in the directory, Chuck McCoy. I will be glad to send you a PDF of my notes so you can go over them. And I hope some of you may want to do that. I have only preached once in the last 5 years, so I'm just a hair nervous. Okay? What's that? You got this. Yeah, I know. I got Marines and stuff over here, so I'm not scared. But I want to dispel a rumor. I am not Santa Claus with a haircut. Okay? Oh, yeah. All right, I have a clicker, and you know a man with a remote control can be dangerous, okay? So I'm going to try and do this the right way. Do you ever feel like this world is not home? I have to be honest with you, as I get older, I feel that more and more. And probably no more than when I am driving. I'm going to give you a lot of text here. But do you ever wish that everybody else was as good a driver as you are? I mean, nobody on their phone except to follow directions on Google Maps, okay? And when the light turns green, I want everybody paying attention so we can go somewhere. I knew an older lady, she was the mother of somebody that I worked with, who while she was driving would have a Pyrex pan and eat pie. And beef stew. And yes, she had a number of accidents. But then I also feel sorry for the people that are up there and ready to go, but the people with a red light now, not just one finishes a left turn, 2, 3, 4, or 5 will go ahead and turn. And I sit there and I'm thinking, come on, people. We'd like to get somewhere too. I think it's just consideration. But I also have concluded that Omaha must be where a lot of former NASCAR drivers have retired or people in training, because I have never lived in a place, and I've lived in a number of places, where so many drivers want to draft or tailgate my bumper. I got to admit, I get nervous when I look in my mirror and that's what I see. But it's not always just pickup trucks. I have to tell you, I'm getting to the place where in my car, safest place I feel is in my garage. In May, my beloved 14-year-old RAV4 was rear-ended at a stoplight, and the guy got out, he felt bad, he said, it's my fault, I wasn't paying attention, and I wasn't mad at him. But I was pretty sad. And then his insurance company totaled my car. So like Dorothy, there are times when I would like to be in a place where there isn't any trouble. Do you hear me? In Hebrews chapter 10, we get something that Paul and Peter tell us about. We are strangers and aliens here, and we're citizens of heaven, but I just remembered this the other day in Hebrews 10. It said this goes back all the way to Abraham and the early saints. This, I don't belong here. I'm waiting for a better country and a better promised land and a better capital city. So this is an old thing. 2,700 years ago, through Isaiah, God said that the day was going to come when he would make a new heaven and earth. And that's picked up in Revelation 21:1 through 22:6. And Peter talks about it in 2 Peter 3. And there he says, it's going to come suddenly like a thief. And we prepare for it not by looking for last-minute warning signs. And I've noticed the prophecy experts that have warning signs all have a different list. Something's wrong with that. And then Jesus never shows up on schedule. That tells you something. But he says, we ought to be focusing on what sort of people we should be in holy conduct and godliness, being diligent to be found without spot or blemish, and in peace. In other words, living the kind of life that will please God so that no matter when it happens, you won't be disappointed. I can do that. For 4,000 years, God's people have needed to remember three things, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. Who we are and who we belong to. Number two, the rules. And number three, why we're here. And that was one of the main purposes of the law and prophets and our New Testament letters, was to remind God's people of these three things so we can stay focused. First, I'm going to give you a little background. Peter addressed Jewish and Gentile Christians in several Roman provinces in what we now know as Asia Minor or modern Turkey. Paul started most of the churches in that area, but Peter is writing to them because Peter and Paul were very much on the same page on this stuff. They were scattered through Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. The geography had not recently changed for these people, but the cultural landscape had changed tremendously. Now you might ask, and Rob, you can help me, you might ask, why were first century Jews spread up in Asia Minor? That's a long way from where the Jews were planted. And when they had gone off to Babylon, didn't they come back to the land? Well, about 50,000 did. But a very large Jewish community kind of said phooey on the big program, going back and waiting for the Messiah. We're going to stay right here in Babylon. And they did for 300 years until one of Alexander the Great's generals. Now, if you don't know, Alexander the Great conquered an empire that stretched from Macedonia or Greece down to Egypt and all the way to the border of India. That's a huge chunk of territory. 4 generals divided that up after his death. And one of them, Seleucus, got control of Asia Minor and Mesopotamia, which is probably 80-90% of it. His descendants took the name Seleucus or Antiochus. And Antiochus was building new cities in Asia Minor, and he had a very unruly group of people. The Jews were known for being very orderly in their family life, their civic life. He hoped maybe they could civilize those people. So he brought 2,000 families from Mesopotamia and moved them into Asia Minor. Fast forward to the first century, they have been there for 200 years. They have synagogues. They are part of that culture. Paul, in the book of Acts, encounters these people. These are the synagogues that he went to. You also have to keep in mind that first century Judaism had a few issues. I hope you have wondered, why, if Jesus is laid out so much in the law and the prophets, did so many Jews have trouble recognizing him? Well, Jesus as Messiah was a hot-button issue. Jesus said that families will be divided over this, and they did. If you look in the book of Acts, you will see we're out in some of these outlying areas. Tremendous division. In fact, if you accepted Jesus as Messiah as a Jew, you very probably were no longer welcome in your synagogue or community. That means your kids are cut off from synagogue school. You're an outsider. Jesus' appearance also triggered the new covenant that had been predicted through Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 31 to 34, God said, I am going to make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the one that I made at Sinai. There was going to be a new covenant. Well, it kicked in when Jesus came. Remember on the night he was betrayed? In fact, we just did this in communion. If you read it in Matthew, he says, with the cup, this is my blood of the new covenant. He is starting the new covenant, inaugurated with his blood. So not only as a Jew have you embraced a controversial Messiah, you also now have to shift to a new covenant and away from the Sinai covenant and traditions. How hard is it to shift away from traditions that your people have kept to some degree for 1,400 years? These are the people he's writing to. Gentile converts had to learn about Israel's God. They had to embrace a new set of moral guidelines, very different sexual ethics, and they had to give up their former gods, idols, and worship systems. Tremendous change in their lives. Have any of you gone through a change to become a follower of Jesus? Some kind of change, I hope. So that brings us to the first thing. Here I'm going to give you a little bit of theology. Remember who you are and who you belong to. Now, if you look ahead quickly, in 1 Peter 3:1, Peter turns to the gune, the wives, the women. So what does that suggest chapter 2 is pointing to? Us guys. So listen up. Companies and organizations are known by two things. They tend to be known by their product and their representatives, their employees. Okay? Kingdom of God, same way. Does God have a good product? Sure. Life, good moral boundaries, God's faithfulness, mercy, hope, peace, faith. Why were Gentiles flocking into Christianity? They didn't have these things. This looks pretty good. It's one of the reasons in my 20s I became a follower of Jesus. My dad was a biology department head. I had lots of things to deal with. I started reading the Bible and I said, no, wait a minute, this is making sense of some things that haven't made sense. And I was drawn to Jesus like to a magnet. His representatives, his covenant people. So let's talk about that. Yeah, I'm behind, aren't I? Okay, sorry, try to keep up. A lot here. All right, Abraham's fleshly descendants, the Israelites, had a very special role to play. The Messiah was going to come into the world through a particular lineage. And I don't know how many of you enjoy genealogies, but if you look at Genesis 5 through 9, 11, then we have the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and chapter 49, Judah. God was laying out the lineage that the Messiah was going to come through. From Adam to David. And the fleshly descendants of Abraham had, I would say, the pole position. They are the in-group. They are the ones that are getting the information, and they had a tremendous list of perks and advantages. If you take the time, just read Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 14. It's not the whole list, but it's most of them. There'll be no miscarriages. All of your crops will succeed. Everything you do will succeed. You'll have so much money. You can lend to surrounding nations. You go through that list. Nobody will be able to overrun you. I am amazed when I read that list. How in the world could you instead say, no, we like what the Canaanites are doing? It hadn't sunk in what was available to them. Romans 3 and 9, Paul will also talk about the advantages they had. And if faithful, a physically, materially blessed, what would you think of no diseases? A materially blessed Israelite nation would draw the world. Surrounding nations would be drawn to Israel's God. But on the other hand, how about if they're unfaithful? Unfortunately, that's what happened. As has already been mentioned, Romans 2:24, there it is, good. As it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Romans 1 through 8 was written to the Jewish Christians in Rome. It says, this is the impact we've had. The nations are turned away. And if you want to read that, and this comes from Isaiah 52:5. If you want to read this history of rebellion, read Exodus, read Numbers, Joshua, especially read Judges. If you like soap operas, forget the ones on TV, read the book of Judges. 1 Samuel through 2 Kings and the prophets, And you begin to get a picture, as I did, that what's wrong with these people? Don't they appreciate what's available? No, they didn't appear to a lot of the time. And first century Romans viewed Jews, this is their terminology, as the haters of mankind. That's the kind of impression they had created. Are there a lot of people around us that don't have a very high view of Christians? I can remember through the 90s, that there were a lot of people who said, hey, I'm not interested in Christianity. Crazy televangelists, greedy, churches are just out for money, immoral clergy, and hypocrites. And it was hard to argue. There's plenty of that around. In fact, Exodus 27, that commandment, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, it's primarily about this. Don't take the name, claim to be God's people, and then stink it up and make him look bad. Ouch. Well, in verses 4 through 8, Peter talks of those who rejected the cornerstone, stumbled, and were disobedient to the word. These are Jews who had the law, they had the prophets, they had the writings, but they failed to recognize the time of Messiah's appearance. And Daniel had even predicted the year he would appear to Israel, and they missed it. You see, they had been misled. For 2 centuries, imaginative, speculative rabbis had kind of created their own picture of Messiah and the last days. They taught that Messiah was coming to give Israel a glorious earthly kingdom. They taught that the Messiah's blessings and eternal life would be for Jews alone. All Gentiles would be destroyed. Where would that leave most of us? That's what they were teaching. They also left out some things. They left out the Messiah's deity. Remember Jewish leaders saying, you make yourself out to be God. Well, Isaiah and Micah had predicted that he would be a child, but also a divine figure. Suffering for sin. Remember when Jesus told Peter, Matthew 16, I've got to go to Jerusalem and suffer and die? Peter blew up. He rebuked him. No, that's not going to happen. But that's what he'd been hearing. And they also left out blessings to the Gentiles. So that was a real problem. So I have some real sympathy for the first century Jewish folks that embraced Jesus. They had a lot to overcome. Sometimes we do too. Then in verses 9 and 10, Peter is going to say, but you are the chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, the people for God's possession. Does that sound familiar? I've put Exodus 19, 5 and 6 up here. That's what God addressed to Israel at Mount Sinai. See any similarities? It's the same terminology because God was going to make a new covenant with Israel and Judah. I'm not surprised the terminology is the same. The problem is it requires some adjustments. Now that's going to bring us to another question. Thank you for asking. Believing Gentiles as a part of Israel? Yeah, from the beginning. God's plan was to ultimately save all the world. In fact, if I can add to what was said a little earlier, in Exodus chapter 9, God explained why he extended the miracles so that his name might be proclaimed throughout the earth. And we are told in chapter 9 of Exodus that some of Pharaoh's officials were listening to Moses. And when Moses said there is a plague coming, they would take preparations to protect their flocks. And that's why, and we're going to see it in a minute, there was a mixed multitude that went out. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First century Jews believed 3 things. They trusted in fleshly descent from Abraham, fleshly circumcision, and being under the Sinai covenant, or law of Moses. Now, you may remember in Matthew 3:9, people came out to John the Baptizer to be immersed, okay, for the Messiah that's coming. And one of the things he said was, do not say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. What did they trust in? One of them was fleshly descent from Abraham, and John, who they viewed as a prophet, said, don't trust in that. In Romans 4, Paul gave what I think was a bunker buster. Because in those first 8 chapters in Romans, talking to Jewish Christians, he said, let's talk about our father, Abraham. Guess what? He was righteous by faith as a Gentile. And he said, sure. He wasn't a descendant of himself. And he was righteous by faith in chapter 15, 2 chapters before circumcision. And it was centuries before the Sinai covenant or law of Moses come in. And what do you call a guy who's not a descendant of Abraham, not circumcised, and not living under the law of Moses? A Gentile. Boom. When I caught that later on, it's like, ooh, wow. The promises to Abraham, big stuff. Genesis 12, 1 through 3, the promises were simply this: personal blessings and protection. God would make his descendants a nation in Canaan. That's the Sinai covenant, Israel in the land. And finally, with Paul's help in Galatians 3, the Messiah's blessings were going to be offered to all of the mishpachah, all of the families, clans, and tribes of the earth. In other words, before there even was a nation of Israel, God says this is ultimately going to wind up in blessings being offered to the whole world. And I say, thank God for that. I'm an ordinary Scotsman. How in the world do I get in on this thing? Because God wanted everybody in on it. And I take a lot of comfort in that. Then several things. And I'm going to go through these quickly. I know time will get away from me. And you'll be getting up and walking out and saying, I'm already anxious to have Brian back next week. In Genesis 17, the circumcision covenant, if you'll read through that, it was for his physical descendants. Well, right then, it was only one, Ishmael. But then it specifically says, and all of your foreign-born servants. And we know from Genesis 14:14, this is hundreds of servants. He fielded 318 fighting men. Abraham's circumcised covenant household was mostly Gentiles. See, there's blockbusters here. Exodus 12:38 says a mixed multitude of Egyptians and Israelites left. And in verses 42 to 49, even before the law of Moses was put in effect, God opened a door to slaves purchased with money and also foreigners who want to participate. If they accept the covenant, the males are circumcised, you bring them in and treat them as native Israelites, full citizenship. See, there are covenant-obeying Gentiles getting into Israel from the beginning. In Joshua 9, a Canaanite city saw what was happening. They didn't want to get wiped out like Jericho did. They come to the Israelites and they begged to be accepted. And they are not only brought in, they became hewers of wood and haulers of water for the tabernacle. They worked with the Levites. They also went away in captivity to Babylon, came back, and they are listed in the genealogies in Nehemiah. They were a part of Israel. The prophets contain clear predictions that the nations, the Gentiles, the Goyim, would be coming to Israel's God in large numbers in the last days. When you look around at churches filled with people that are not physical descendants of Abraham, don't be surprised. That's what was predicted. We should rejoice in that. I had to conclude, as I read through Paul, and you gradually put these things together, that in Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, and Philippians, Paul defines true sons of Abraham. Galatians 3. The true circumcision. Romans 2, Philippians 3, and all Israel. If you want to get the definition on those, just read Paul. Put away the paperback theology books, read Paul. He and Peter are laying this stuff out. God's people have always begun with a core of believers from the lineage of the Messiah and the patriarchs, with believing Gentiles and outsiders welcomed in. I look at this and I think of myself. Knowing who you are and who you belong to with positive expectations, boundaries, and accountability is a very good thing. My dad let me know that I was a McCoy. I was a representative of the family, and the family values integrity. Becca, integrity. Yeah. She was once told that she had more integrity than any of the other teachers at the school where she's at. Yes. But you see, I saw that in my dad. I saw it in my granddad. We obey the laws, we pay our bills, we tell the truth, we don't cheat on taxes, and we respect others. And I was told that my behavior would reflect on the family. I took that seriously. It not only led to a lot of blessings, it kept me out of a lot of trouble. It's a good thing. You see, in Jesus, we are double owned by God, by creation. He owns everything that he created. But because of sin, he also had to buy us back with the blood of Jesus. So we should feel pretty thrilled to be representatives and members of God and Son Universal, for so we are. Then we go to the point that we will really get down to us. Remember the rules? I'm good with rules. I really am. Because for me, life was confusing for 5 years. Between 5 and 10, I got a lot of spankings. Yes, I grew up in the dark ages. I know that. But I got a lot of spankings. I mean, mom and dad, and then I'd do my thing, and I'd get a spanking. I realize now what they were trying to do. The neural pathway between my brain and my ears hadn't developed, and they were trying to get to me through another set of nerves. But at 10, and I don't know what triggered it, but I suddenly realized that if I listen to what they're saying, and then I do what they tell me and don't do what they tell me not to do, no spankings. Even a few more blessings. Okay, I get it. And if you put that into the adult world, how would that apply? If we just listen and live within the boundaries, okay? How many penalties do you get? Well, there may be a few, but you may not deserve them all. Yeah, it works. You see, and think about it. What would human society be like if we did not have commonly accepted and enforced rules? Quickly turn into anarchy. How about some of our big cities? My dad took me to Northern Ireland and Scotland a couple of years before he died, and my mom said, it's dangerous over there. He said, there's places in some of our big cities a whole lot more dangerous than Northern Ireland. It was true, and that's just gotten worse. And if you think traffic is a problem now, what would it be like if there were no laws? We would be driving in the world of Mad Max, and your next car would be fitted out with some serious weapons. I know how that hits me. Tailgate me, and I'm going to unload some serious ordnance on you. Fortunately, we can't do that. But think about how law systems develop and grow, and they always grow. They don't shrink. In Genesis 2, in Eden, almost total freedom, just one boundary God gets to set and determine the moral good and evil boundaries. In Genesis 9, after the flood, you can eat everything except blood and no homicide. That's simple. Then we get to the law. And Exodus through Deuteronomy, there were 10 commandments and 603, by Jewish count, 603 other legal applications. You say, that's pretty complicated. Yeah, but remember, this was a constitution and a law system for a nation. So they not only needed theological information, they also needed civil laws, health guidelines, relationship instructions, laws for warfare, dealing with other nations. That's why it was a big law system. And the 10 Commandments, really, it was simple. It just identifies, do this and don't do this. I mean, here it is, very simple. Honor one God, don't make or worship idols, represent God well. Everybody needs a day of rest. Honor parents, don't steal, no adultery, no murder, no coveting, no false testimony. That was simply God's shorthand. Do this, don't do that. Nice and simple. I like it. I also consider sin from the wisdom aspect. If you read Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the prophets, and history, you begin to see why God said no to certain things. And I found this very helpful. I don't know about, I do know about you. I don't know what they are, but do you have any temptations? Yeah. However, I realized that if I would list the cons with the pros, here's the list of possible penalties and risks and damages. I found out there was a whole lot of sin that just didn't look that tempting anymore. I don't like the price tag. No thanks. I don't need to get into that. So I think that's helpful. And sin is serious business. When we go to verse 1, Peter identifies several specific attitudes and actions that need to be eliminated. Malice, kakia, ill will towards others. Now I'm going to ask a question. I don't expect much response, but you know. How many of you are familiar with the musical version of A Christmas Carol called Scrooge? With Albert Finney? Good, thank you. I love that movie because I see myself in it, or where I was. Because early in that, it's a musical. I don't mean to scare you, but he starts out with this song, I hate people, I deplore them. And then he lists all things he hates about people. But after he gets visited by the spirit of Christmas present, and he had a big goblet full of the milk of human kindness, he starts changing. I like life, life likes me, life and I have a perpetual spree. And I have to go through that change myself sometimes when I realize I'm getting grouchy. And I don't want to turn my wife loose to tell you how often I get grouchy. But malice, how about guile and deceit? Dolos, insincerity to deceive. Are you tired of the phishing scams on your phone? That's what it is. Simple deceit. They're trying to get your money. And they're not going to give you the product. Hypocrisy, and that's literally a Greek word, hypocrisis. It was mask wearing. You know anybody that wears different faces when they deal with different people? We call it two-faced. I've never had anybody accuse me of being two-faced, because if I had another face, do you think I'd be wearing this one? That was supposed to be a joke. That's okay. If I had a drummer once set up his drum in my class. I would tell a joke, and he'd do, well, it didn't work that well then. Okay. And envy, phthanus, resentment towards the success or possessions of others. And slander, katalalia, which is bad talk. It's essentially trash talking other people to make them look bad in the eyes of others, and usually you look better. Then in verse 11, he says, abstain from fleshly lusts. We often don't think about this, but lusts of the flesh also damage us spiritually and psychologically. And sometimes after a while you start realizing, I'm going to quit doing that. You start feeling better. And your emotions and your guilt starts to get better. I learned there were a lot of things that, they seemed like fun, but after a while it's kind of disappointing. It wasn't worth it. That's healthy. But abstain from these things. If you want to know what, Paul gives us a great list in Galatians 5. The works of the flesh are evident. Sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality. And I don't want anybody to clap and cheer for your favorite. Idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. In other words, the list could go on, but this will give you an idea. But I warn you, as I have warned you before, those who do such things, and this is present tense, those who continue to practice these, will not inherit the kingdom of God. As I said, sin is serious business. Well, God created us with appetites, food, sex, desire for acceptance and accomplishment. Those aren't inherently bad, but God ordained where and how to satisfy them. And he identified sin not to keep us from having fun, but warning us where disappointment will be found. Our spiritual enemy wants to deceive us into thinking that we can find satisfaction where God has not ordained it to be found. Have you spent any time looking? And temptation is the attempt to sucker us into thinking that sin is good, desirable, fun, and a whole lot better than it really is. Our toughest battle may be with our own appetites and our own will. My advice is, and I've had to learn this the hard way, some of these battles won't be ended quickly. I've noticed there were some things that when I became a Christian, I gave up right away, no problem. There are other things that continue to be a battle, and those you've got to settle in for the long haul. You need to change your desires, keep saying no until your last breath if necessary, and that's what Paul was talking about with fighting the good fight of faith and dying daily to yourself. But good news, Jesus experienced temptation. He is a sympathetic high priest. God is gracious and patient, and he gave us the Spirit. In Galatians 5, he says to help us keep saying no to those things that keep coming back. So if you do something you shouldn't and you feel bad, in a way you ought to feel good because things are still working. It's when you can sin and not feel bad, then you're in trouble. So don't give up. Keep getting up and stumbling in God's direction. Because if you compare Hebrews 11 and the saints that are listed there with the lives that they lived, you realize that's what they did. I mean, David commit adultery and then have the husband of the wife that you committed adultery on killed? You can't get any worse than that in my imagination. Did God forgive David? Yeah, and David never did it again. So get up and keep fighting the battle. Keep stumbling, okay? In verse 12, he says, keep your excellent. I'm probably behind again. Yes, I am. Sorry about that. Keep your excellent behavior excellent among outsiders. Paul said it, walk in a manner worthy. So if you're slandered and ridiculed, you ever heard that? Well, Christians are just a bunch of hypocrites. Okay, not a bunch of goody two-shoes. On Judgment Day or before, it will be recognized that this was a better way to live. One of the saddest phone calls I ever got was a friend of mine that I worked with. He wanted to get his business going, work 7 days a week. I said, I don't want to do that. I want the weekend off to be with my wife. He thought I was a knucklehead. Until 3 years later, when he called me up and said, well, Nancy left me. I wish I'd have listened to you. And I said, I wish you would have too, Dave. But he said, but I was on the verge of suicide, and I saw your face in the mirror. No, I didn't put in a supernatural appearance. But he remembered me, and he said, I think I better turn back to Jesus. Was my example worthwhile? Yeah. I'm sorry that he lost his family, but he learned a difficult lesson. The only effective counterbalance to hypocrites and bad examples is a much larger number of good examples. And I got a lot of control over what kind of an example I am. What surrounding nations thought of Yahweh was heavily impacted by what they saw in Israel. What people think of Christianity probably depended on me. Then he says, submit yourself to every human institution. I'm going to talk faster. You'll need to listen quicker. And he says, this is simply right. Obey rulers, pay taxes, obey traffic laws. It's God's will that by doing what's right, we silence the ignorance of foolish people who think that only idiots and saps live within the law, control their behavior, and are considerate of others. Verse 17, good summary. Show respect to everybody, love other believers, fear God, honor earthly rulers, and that'll get you on the right track. Servants, which is probably close to employees in many cases, be submissive to those you work under. Not just the good ones, also those who are unreasonable. Paul talked about this in Colossians 3. You ever been mistreated by a supervisor, a boss, or an academic dean? Yeah, we probably all have run into some of that. But there's one good thing you can do. Learn from it. And if you ever wind up in a position of authority, remember what you experienced and do it better than they did. You can turn an evil into a good. There's a huge lie rolling around. It's my life. I don't owe anything to anybody. And what I say and do doesn't affect anybody else. None of their business. And I'm not sure what universe they're living in, But we all have a reminder that we do owe something to somebody. It's on your body. It's right in the center of your abdomen. It's called a belly button or a navel. May not be right to talk about it, but after today, I'm done anyway. Okay? But that's there partially to remind you that you do owe your very existence to a biological mother and father. And what we say and do doesn't affect others. Are you kidding me? Have you ever been hurt or encouraged by the words of others? You ever been impacted by the actions of others, kindness or carelessness? Yeah, you throw a rock into a pond, ripples go out all the way to the shoreline. So when we do things, we really ought to think about what ripples we might create. Paul's going to say, none of us lives to themselves. Lastly, remember who you are. Yep, I know, I need to talk even faster. But you were once lost sheep that didn't appreciate God's care. So Jesus died and suffered so that we could get back in. And Paul will remind us in 1 Corinthians 10, here's all the stuff that Israel did. Don't imitate that. That wasn't good. Turned out bad. But we have lots of encouragement, and I give you the scriptures, to find good examples. Follow good examples. Become a good example yourself. You know, we humans are natural imitators and copycats. How many of you can remember junior high? I know for some younger people, not tough. Remember junior high? I ran into a few people and said, I'd like to go through that again. I wouldn't. But do you remember the cool kids would get certain clothes, or they would do something or say something, and right away all of us uncool kids would be copying it. Remember that? I don't know what that stuff is that makes you cool, but I knew I didn't have a speck of it. But I do remember two people. Here's a question for you. How many of you can name over 10 people that you went to grade school with in junior high? Good. I can't. If I thought about it, I might be able to get up to 10, but there are two guys that I remember clearly. One of them was in junior high school in Arkansas. The other was in high school, and the first one's name was Mark Thompson. His example in how he treated other people, I saw that and I said, yeah, that's how it ought to be. And I was trimming Christmas trees in northern Michigan. I got a lot of Christmas trees, used a big long knife, and we're going around the trees, and Tim Dennison is preaching to us stuff that his mom has taught him about how men should treat women. And I am listening to all this and I'm saying, this is good stuff. And Mark Thompson. So isn't it interesting that the two guys I remember clearest, I remember their faces, I remember their voice, remember their names, were the two guys that were good examples to me. Okay. I'm going to finish up quick here. And you're saying, yeah, sure, that's what you said before. But think about how powerful examples are. How many things have you learned to do or not do by someone else's example? I think you would exhaust a lot more time collecting that than you think. There's lots of it. My dad was a good example. I learned skills from two good residential builders. Lawyers who get a bad rap, great example of how to stay cool and present a rational argument when somebody is opposing you. I thought, yeah, that's good. Need to get that. And as I look around the room, one of the toughest things many of us are facing or will face is how to grow old gracefully. I will confess to you, I have not done the best job of that. Your mind and body don't work as well as they did. Our civilization does not value experience-based wisdom. And all of a sudden, and I'll bet I'm behind. No, I'm not. I'm good. Okay. But then all of a sudden, you're not needed or wanted for what you were good at and may still be capable of. Has that happened to anybody? Am I the only one? All right. Even growing old gracefully is something for which good examples are badly needed. When people tell me to act my age, I want to respond, I don't know how, I've never been this old before. But good examples can show us how. You see, good examples show us two things. They show us that it can be done and how to do it. I know some of you are looking at that skunk. Well, you're supposed to. But a lot of people don't live life very well because they haven't seen many good examples. You look at their families and those they hang around, they haven't seen many good examples. I've lived in Michigan, I've lived in South Dakota, and I've been through Wisconsin and Minnesota a number of times. And there are times of the year when there are a lot of dead skunks on the road. I don't know what it is. Skunks just don't have this road crossing thing down. And then I got an example of why. I was doing a couple of camps in Wisconsin, lived in Michigan, but I drove over there, and my aunt and uncle had a cabin up near Hazelhurst, Minocqua. Anybody been to Wisconsin? Probably not. And so I decided to spend a couple of days with them over the weekend. I drove up there. Wisconsin's back roads are great. They tend to all be paved. The one I was on, nice new blacktop, white strip right down the middle of the road. I got my brights on, nobody else around. And I'm sailing along, and all of a sudden I noticed this strange movement in the middle of the road. So I slowed down as I got up there. It was a skunk. And the skunk was going down the middle of that road, right on the white line. And I thought to myself, that's why a lot of skunks get hit on the road. They spend too much time in a dangerous place. It also taught me something else. New meaning to that old, why did the chicken cross the road? To show the skunk that it could be done and how to do it. So, as God's people, representatives on this earth, we have plenty of examples to show us it can be done. Jesus and faithful people before us have done it. They show us what it looks like. Scripture gives us guidelines. We have good examples. And there are many now and many more to come who are going to need somebody to show them and tell them truth and show them what it looks like to be God's covenant people. And folks, that's where we are. So remember who you are and who you belong to. Remember the rules and remember why you're here. And now, while I have gone long, and I'm sorry, although not too sorry, because I have more loyalty to the Word of God than those of you who can't sit here very long, because if I had to, I'd get up and leave too. Think about these things. And Frank's going to come. He's going to lead us in our song of commitment and decision. If you've not yet accepted Jesus, if you're not in the new covenant, please consider that and look into it. If you have questions, we've got a great bunch of elders here. They care about you. They care about the church. And they would love to talk to you about things. So as Frank leads us in our last song, I would encourage you, they'll be around the back of the room. Find them. Talk to them. I'll be here. I know you're probably afraid I'll talk your arm off, but we still care about you. So Frank, please.